Thanks everybody who helped put this together, and without further ado, here you go, Scott. Scott Bear, everybody.
Everyone who sets the microphones down. Well, hey everybody. So thank you for having me. I want to say a few things. Thank you before I get started. So thanks to the Table Lyceum Association Board and the speakers that are way smarter than me that do this every month. Thank you to Sidecar for hosting this. I know it's a night that you guys normally have off. James, the bookshop, thank you for partnering with us to do this. Julie, thanks for letting me ruin our weekend a little bit by prepping for this. We're going to Traverse City, Michigan. So I'd like to start tonight off with a quote about maybe agonizing about the kind of historical stories we tell ourselves. So there it is. Right. So in January of 1995, under political pressure, the Smithsonian canceled a planned exhibit marking the 50th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which is to be held at the National Air and Space Museum. The proposed exhibit of the Enola Gay, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress bomber that, piloted by Paul Tibbets, dropped the atomic bomb nicknamed Little Boy on Hiroshima in August of 1945, drew criticism starting in late 1994 when the Air Force Association, unhappy with the planner's slant towards thoughtful and away from celebratory, released a draft script, labeled copy images and artifact list to the media. The curators and historians who were putting together the exhibit fought their critics for a few months before radically revising the exhibit to much more bland and more patriotic. The curator of the Smithsonian's Aeronautics Department at the time said of the conflict between the two groups, do you want to do an exhibition intended to make veterans feel good, or do you want an exhibition that will lead our visitors to think about the consequences of the atomic bombing of Japan? I don't think we can do both. And so this will start us into what we're going to talk about tonight, and it illustrates that the stories we tell ourselves about the past matter. So for those of you guys that don't know me, my name is Scott Bear, and I have been teaching at Batavia for, this is my 19th year. Mostly, I would say I teach European history, and I have to do a really quick disclaimer. I'm going to step over here for a second. I'd like to go on record and state that I am well aware of my role and responsibilities as a dedicated employee of PPS 101, subject to board policy and contractual obligations set forth in our collective bargaining agreement, which I helped to negotiate last week. Any statements I make here tonight, any aspersions, insults, and negative characterizations I might make, while fact-based, should be taken in the context of being uttered in a bar. So the title of this talk, I don't think it's a good one, but it's what I threw together. Defending Democracy, Navigating the Culture Wars in the Classroom. It's not my area of expertise at all, although I've always taken a pretty acute interest in the role that history education should play in cultivating citizens in our democracy. And in our democracy, the time that I've been teaching, there have always been difficult subjects for teachers to navigate. When I started in 2005, we had things like the invasion of Iraq, non-existent weapons of mass destruction, black sites, extraordinary rendition, extrajudicial imprisonment, torture and killings, the Patriot Act, and Islamophobia to discuss. Later, we had the Great Recession, its causes, the Occupy Wall Street protests, debates about healthcare policy, remember the death panels, racist calls for the first black president's birth certificate, presidential elections, Supreme Court confirmation hearings, the rebellion in Ferguson, the climate crisis, against denial, legalization of same-sex marriage, calls for LGBTQ rights, and mass shooting after school shooting after mass shooting after school shooting. Then the Trump era came with new political rhetoric, and maybe it started with that racist birther stuff. Alternative facts and a rise in white nationalism and domestic terrorism culminating in Charlottesville, the Colin Kaepernick Take a Knee protest, the Me Too movement, the COVID-19 pandemic, public health policy, the Black Lives Matter movement, the coup attempt on January 6th, and the recent overturning of Roe v. Wade. To name a few topics that have made our jobs as social studies teachers interesting. So, as social studies teachers, on top of all the social emotional baggage that teenagers tend to bring to the classroom, we're also expected to skillfully wade through troubled waters and controversial topics with our students, all the while trying to be purveyors of historical context and critical thought, sourcing and fact checking, moderating tense disagreements, championing democracy, all the while trying to avoid rancorous partisanship and other landmines. And if it were only these things, that I've experienced in my almost 20 years, I'd probably be standing here giving a talk about European history tonight. But as many of you guys know, I was thrown into a weird situation about 2 years ago. So this is a photograph of me being home on October 19th with my wife Julie, along with a bunch of our friends and family. And Matt Holm, who was also here, helped us to renew our vows in our backyard for our 20-year wedding anniversary. You can give Julie a round of applause for that. That's really impressive. She's willing to do that. But my life would take a pretty surreal turn as I received a phone call from one of my colleagues and friends about something concerning he had seen at the school board meeting that same night. And by the way, he's also a union rep in attendance. So while we were renewing our vows in the backyard, a parent of one of my students, instead of sending me an anniversary gift, should have done that, was angrily blasting me in public about some lesson that I taught that he didn't like in front of assistant principals, the principal, and district administrators, the superintendent. In short, all of my bosses. And quick aside, everyone who teaches knows that a lot of our resources are online now, and there's more visibility and transparency than ever. This parent never emailed me or called me or discussed materials or my lessons or my approach. Essentially, we're neighbors. We're both Batavians. He sent his kids to public school, and therefore we're partners in educating his kid and all the kids in my class. And so I never had a chance to talk to him. Had we had the chance, I could have addressed concerns, given copies of any materials he wanted to see, and we could have forged that really essential partnership that goes along with teaching and learning between parents and kids and teachers. And so instead, climbed 3 or 4 steps above my head and did what talking head pundits had been ginning up parents to do in the months leading up to that moment in the fall of 2021, went straight to the school board. So in that Tuesday meeting, he complained for the maximum amount of time, distributed a 30-page handout of defamatory propaganda misrepresenting me, my teachings, my interaction with students. He was agitated, misinformed, wrong-headed, but in fairness, and I will say this, I believe that he was sincere about his concerns when he accused me, his student's history teacher, devoted public servant, of indoctrination, Stalinism, and reverse racism. He even opened the line about protecting his kids. Okay, so his remarks started off with, and by the way, this is all on public record. If you guys want to pull up the YouTube video, you can. So I'm not saying anything that it wasn't on public display. His remarks started with an awkward and clumsy moral comparison of sorts between Adolf Hitler, who he said was responsible for 18 million deaths. Sure, I qualified that. And Marxist communism, which he said was responsible for 100 million deaths. In other words, Hitler was better. And then he put me in the latter category. And so that's just for fun. That's for fun. Well, most of his historical references were unintelligible, and he may have been accusing me of some kind of Stalinism or Maoism or something like that. Not sure. I suppose proof. He went on to reference and read aloud before the school board. I have the artifact right here, without the slightest bit of irony, a meme or a joke. And by the way, for John, who's John? Meme means an online joke. Without any irony, the meme reads, "Capitalism, more like crapitalism." Am I right, ladies? Attributed to Karl Marx, probably. Now, it's a joke, and an 18-year-old student of mine that 8 years ago made it. He was trying to be funny when he made it. But the guy who was verbally assailing me at the school board thought it was damning proof of Karl Marx speaking to my students from the pastures of Das Kapital beyond the grave. Reminiscent of McCarthyism from generations past, he attended for the board and the public to see me as engaging some sort of dangerous program of Soviet-style indoctrination. I'll take that off. Did you guys get some pictures of that? Okay. So, up to that point, his student was one of the best in my class, very engaged. She, listened to lectures, asked questions, was engaged in small group discussions. She was really a thinker. His history teacher, we love stuff like that. And sometimes I could tell that what I would say in class would validate her family's conservative point of view, and sometimes it would challenge preconceived ideas she had. But we were being a teacher and a student. And so I think the thing, though, to put this in context, that took the dad from the couch to the school board meeting was a lesson where I attempted to have students make connections between historical British American race-based slavery and the characteristics of our modern economy. Evidence, Exhibit A. So this was I used a lot of well-sourced charts and graphs demonstrating the U.S. as an outlier in the areas that we all know the U.S. is an outlier in. Our relative tolerance of high degrees of wealth concentration, high rates of military spending, per capita healthcare costs, gun homicide rates, rates of incarceration, childhood poverty rates, and police killings. We lead the world in those things. for developed countries. I also highlighted important empirical racial disparities between our black and white communities in the US, as this slide shows that white households have a median household wealth by a factor of 100 times that of our black counterparts. Also, that black infant mortality rates, homicide rates, and incarceration rates, as you can see on this slide, are multiple times higher than for people that look like me. I had students work in groups. I had them interpret and derive meaning from these charts and graphics, ask questions about them, and then grapple the ways in which, and potentially why, the U.S. economy and culture differs from other developed nations, and students were asked to consider what this data, and the data containing obvious racial disparities, reveals about the health and function of our economy, our culture, our democracy, and legal systems. And students generated their own questions and comments throughout, and they had some good small group discussion, large group discussion afterwards. And I used their experience with this data and discussion about it to have them consider the legacies of North American race-based slavery and understand and critique and offer from the relator's point of view that Americans tend to have a higher cultural tolerance of brutality tied to the existence of slavery historically. And the parents' complaint came as a result of my asking students to consider the long-term implications of race-based slavery and other more recent forms of institutional and systemic racism, not merely as a set of historical circumstances, but as forces that have helped propel the U.S. to become an economic juggernaut on the world stage, and as a set of centuries-long social conditions whose economic, political, and racial legacies led to other racially discriminatory policies, and maybe, just maybe, these legacies might still live with us today. So, long story short, white fragility was on full display downtown as I was accused of creating an anti-white narrative. And it was a lot for me to process. It would amount to lots of hours of meetings, fact-finding with my students, discussion with my union representation, inspections of the walls of my classroom, meetings with administrators, me seeking redress with our then superintendent, school board president, and writing my own accounts. I think it's 13 pages. It was ridiculous. Anyway, so it's important, I think, to note that this is the first time I used the lesson, and I've used it 10 times since. Fall of 2021, I used it last Thursday. And every time I've used it, it's been engaging and an effective lesson, and it remains so. And so this is not unique to me, and the context I'm going to give this is that teachers we know and librarians across the country are facing these authoritarian forces that seek to censor public schooling, learning spaces, and weaken public education, and ultimately diminish democracy and denigrate core American values. And as we'll see, these forces, they're not new, and they should amount to background noise for public school teachers, but they're a lot more than that. And so this work of creating informed, engaged, empathetic, and active citizens who are ready to read books, go bookshops, and also the public good is too important. And educators in this room tonight and those that support them, we're doing important work and we don't need to be intimidated out of it. So, I guess I'll get into the focus for tonight. So, the recent anti-woke and anti-CRT bills, akin to Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, book bans, and other efforts to censor public education are not new, but they're dangerous, and not only because they seek to erode critical discussions in our classrooms and critical materials in our school libraries, but they're dangerous for a myriad of other reasons. One, that the passage of these laws and pressure on educators ultimately put pressure on vulnerable student populations, students of color, LGBTQ students, and research shows that these students see eliminations of content in books as hostile and unwelcoming to them, which has adverse academic outcomes. And censoring the classroom of uncomfortable history leaves all students unprepared to do the important work of considering how to address racism, bigotry, and other social injustices. When taken in a larger context, such well-funded and well-coordinated attacks constitute an attack on small d democracy itself by undermining civic education, eroding our historical memory of forces and trends that pose a threat to democratic institutions. In short, it's a fight that we're in whether we want it or not, and we can't afford to lose it. And because it's about basic, small d, democratic ethics, it's a fight that has to be removed from the realm of partisanship. Democracy and civic education is not a red versus blue issue. And in my personal view, while we must not be partisan in schools and school personnel, we can't also be neutral in this fight. Our kids' future and the future of our diverse society and democracy are at stake. So over the years, while reading history and developing curriculum and planning lessons and all that stuff, on the topic of neutrality, I often thought of this very famous quote by Howard Zinn. You can't be neutral in moving train. Essentially, it refers to the idea, and I love the visual because I imagine my great big self standing. I tried to board a train at Shea Stadium one time, and I had little, like much smaller people than me, elbow past me and get on the train. So I think of that moment a lot when I think of being on a train. But standing on a train, because the little people took my seat. And just sort of like moving along at however fast trains move here. So you're standing still, but the train's moving, and the train represents kind of the cultural narrative and the broader culture. And so by standing there, what you're not doing is neutrality, you sort of ride the train. And so I would argue that all of us have seen those very famous online videos where you see a school administrator or a state official explaining how you have to teach the other side of the Holocaust, or the other side of the transatlantic slave trade. But there's a whole host of other issues that public schools, in my personal view, need to be about. We need to prefer small-d democratic values over authoritarianism and political expression. We need to be about civic engagement, not apathy. We need to be diversity as a strength and not xenophobia and ethnocentrism. We need to be about human rights and preserving those versus discriminating against those people in their human rights. We need to know how to dismantle racism and not promote it. We need to be inclusive and empowering and not marginalizing of LGBTQ people, persons with disability, and minorities. We ought to promote equality for girls and women, versus sexism. We ought to, view opportunity and justice as the norm and not abject generational poverty. We ought to think that experts belong in the classroom more than misinformation. That our ideas, when we bring them into a public school classroom, should rest on empirical foundation and not religious dogma, or whatever I happen to be thinking at the moment. And that history should be critical and not a bunch of mythology and nationalist American exceptionalism. So that is, I don't think you can be neutral on these things, and I think that the public schools must be about the things on the left. So we're going to do three things tonight. One, I'm going to talk about, give some context about this fight over history and history teaching, along with a closer look at the current moral panic over what the panickers call critical race theory and LGBTQ agenda. We'll also do a quick status check about where we're at and go beyond the headlines to look at the impact this is all having on teaching and learning. And I'll conclude with some policy recommendations from some studies that I read, and hopefully get a little discussion at the end with the educators that I know are in this room. Okay, do we know who this person is? This is Guy Smiley from Sesame Street. And so that means we're going to play a game show. And here's what I need for you guys to do, right? We're going to have a little fun with this. So when you see a word come up, it's a bar after all. We can say loud things. I'd like for you just to read the word but kind of say it out loud. Like, wheel, fortunate thing. Can we do that? I'll give you a cue, right? Let's try it. Don't be shy, right? Here we go. So off we go. The game show is called No. You're racist. Okay, so I'm going to throw a few things up on the screen. Okay, I will have 3 different quotes, and I will also have 3 options. We'll play a little matching game. Okay, that's what we'll play. So the first quote, this is kind of a gimme. You guys have all seen this. Slaves develop skills which, in some instances, could be applied for their personal benefit. Is it A, a 1961 Alabama textbook shaped by the Daughters of the Confederacy? Is it B, the Florida State Board of Education's current history standards? Or is it C, a cringy fake dialogue in a PragerU video attributed to Frank Douglas? B. You guys are so smart. Hey, 1 for the room. Hey, give yourself a hand. Okay, next quote. I'm certainly not okay with slavery, but the Founding Fathers made a compromise to achieve something great. And making the United States. Ooh, I told you it's what? It's cringy, isn't it? Let's see. Let's see. You guys knew that too. I can feel it. Okay, and lastly, it should be noted that slavery was the earliest form of Social Security. Think about this, don't you? You have to think about it. It's A. Okay. All right. Hey, so here's the thing. I think the thread we're pulling out of this is these aren't that different statements. It all kind of infers that, slaves were pretty happy when they were slaves, and black people should have been happy with that sort of thing. To various degrees, of course. But this, moreover, what we tell ourselves about history is not new. Okay. So hopefully that game show experience reveals that the fight over what's in our textbooks and classrooms isn't new, and that efforts to censor our classrooms and how we talk about race aren't that far removed from threats we might expect to hear from, say, neo-Confederates or segregationists. As experts took a close look, or taken an honest look at our classrooms over the 20th century, I think it's fair to say that black history has been a sideshow to the white-dominated narrative, and stories about the black experience tend to be marginalized. Atrocities like lynchings, go unmentioned, and slavery and contemporary stories about institutionalized racism get insufficient coverage. From the turn of the century through the early decades of the 20th, monuments were even erected to celebrate leaders who fought to maintain slavery and a white supremacist racial economic order. The United Daughters of the Confederacy, we referenced the game show, spent decades lobbying and pressuring textbooks to put a strong emphasis on lost cause views of the Civil War and Reconstruction, glorifying white supremacy, justifying segregation, and Jim Crow governance and terror. Kevin Levine, who's a historian, had said about the Daughters of the Confederacy, with all the attention they've received in terms of reference to monuments, I think their most lasting impact was in controlling and censoring textbooks. But importantly, the Daughters of the Confederacy's lost cause mythology has been challenged by black historians as early as 1913. Mississippi in 1908 finally adopted the textbook, Conflict and Change, which confronted lynching and dehumanizing aspects of slavery in ways previous textbooks had not. And if you look closely at that, anybody read the name of that historian there? Anybody see it? And James Lowen, who was the one who wrote Lies My Teacher Told Me, I think published in the early 80s, if I'm not mistaken. You guys can, history teachers can correct me on that. And so Mississippi students were not required to learn about the civil rights movement before 2011. In the picture that you see here, a Confederate flag hangs in the Robert E. Lee High School gym during an assembly in 1968. And so the culture wars we're talking about here were always part of Censoring the Classroom, both then and now. So an important idea that I want to throw out there that I do try to hammer home with my students is that these culture war fights are deeper than the last 3 years. And really all I can do tonight is give you a few snapshots and offer a few glimpses at when they kind of rear their heads. And really when boiled down, the argument over what our history classrooms look and sound and feel like all kind of comes down to is arguments over which voices are the ones that matter. And so what I say at the top here is, I think, a pretty basic statement to anybody who studies history, which history isn't the past. History is the stories that we tell ourselves about the past. And it's not only stories that we tell, it might be stories that we don't tell ourselves. And there are powerful interests in what remains in the stories we tell or what is erased from our historical memory. And for that reason, history is a weapon. And the culture wars essentially are weaponizing culture to shape and censor conversations, which is what we're talking about here. Okay, another example, right? So enter historian George Washington Williams, who's a fascinating figure, fought for the Union Army at the age of 14 years old, was later ordained as a minister and served in the Ohio State Legislature. He was probably most known as being a historian where he wrote the history of the Negro race in America from 1619 to 1880. I believe he wrote that in 1882. And I actually first learned about him, I listened to a podcast or read something by Heather Cox Richardson. If you don't listen to her or read some of her stuff, she does a great job of linking modern day events to the past. And so he had given a speech essentially about the experience of black Americans in the U.S. on the 4th of July of 1876 in Avondale, Ohio, which was America's centennial celebration. And he got a very warm reception, both by people live and in letters that he received after the fact. And so this encouraged him to write this history. And the book was well received by historians in the 1880s. And in his own words, why he said it was important to write it, he said, not as a blind panegyrist or as a partisan apologist, but from a love for the truth of history, I have striven to record the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, and have not striven to revive sexual animosities or race prejudices. I have avoided comments so far as it was consistent with the clear exposition of the truth. My whole aim has been to write a thoroughly trustworthy history, and what I have written, if it had no other merit, is reliable. In this work, interestingly enough, I was doing a little reading on it, that he is one of the first to coin the term crimes against humanity when describing American slavery. He also uses that same term when he describes the treatment of the Congolese in King Leopold's Congo around the turn of the century as well. So he coins that term, crimes against humanity. And his work, though, never gained the kind of traction in the broader narrative that one of his counterparts did, Frederick Jackson Turner, who composed a more romanticized history and with more American exceptionalist themes. He played a more dominant narrative, and it sucked a lot of the oxygen up in the predominantly white American readership. And so we learn in this story that privileging white historians, it turns out, is also very American. And so in the late 90s, John Hope Franklin, whose father actually was present during the Tulsa Massacre, wrote a biography of George Washington Williams in 1998 and rekindled interest in him. This came from the reading I did with Heather Cox Richardson. This sort of illustrates the idea that maybe as we start talking about moving towards a more inclusive history, she says, isn't so radical, but it's getting back to where we should have been all along. Okay? As black historians like George Washington Williams had important histories for us to read. So moral panics, like what our current politics characterize as critical race theory and LGBTQ ideology, have lots of context in our country. And moral panics exist over race, have existed over race mixing and desegregation. Moral panics have existed over creeping communism, socialism in the context of the Red Scare, McCarthyism, and the Cold War. Moral panics have existed over school prayer. Moral panics existed over flag burning and not being sufficiently patriotic in other contexts. Moral panics have existed over anti-war protests, and various moral panics have existed over immigration. And in this case, a moral panic existed over the teaching of science in schools. The rallying cry for parental rights has a long history in this country too, and it dates back at least to this 1925, famously known as the Scopes trial, but the trial of John Scopes was a high school science teacher in Tennessee who volunteered to be defended in a test case that challenged a state law in Tennessee banning instruction in the theory of evolution in a state-funded school. And interestingly enough, Tennessee also required teachers to use a textbook that explicitly described and endorsed evolution too. Ultimately, he was found liable for doing just that, was fined $100, later was overturned on a technicality. And the trial essentially pitted those who argued that evolution could be consistent with religion against Christian fundamentalists who said that the Word of God, as revealed in the Bible, took priority over all human knowledge. The case was thus seen both as a theological contest and as a trial on whether evolution should be taught in schools. And so we have, teachers like Scopes were confused as teachers are now by the culture war. Okay, so let's talk just for a moment about the civil rights movement as it relates to education. So after Brown v. Board in 1954, the landmark Supreme Court case that legally desegregated schools, and over the next 60 years, Congress has enacted civil rights statutes prohibiting discrimination in education by denying federal financial assistance. Laws like Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits race, color, and national origin discrimination. Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, which probably is the thing that allows me to coach pro wrestling right now, but prohibits sex discrimination. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which prohibits disability discrimination. Title II of the American Disabilities Act of 1990, which prohibits disability discrimination by public entities, among other things. And these laws have represented a national commitment to end discrimination, at least legally, in education, and they've brought formerly excluded people into the mainstream of American public schools with the aim of advancing the idea that every individual has the right to develop his or her talents to the fullest. So as a result, barriers to communities of color, immigrants, women, girls, LGBTQ students, and students with disabilities have been broken down, and our schools have become more inclusive, more diverse, and less hostile to historically marginalized groups as a result. Okay, so with a lot of the legal barriers having been broken down, battles then moved from courts to communities, classrooms, and universities. An early and a successful example of this was the Mexican-American Chicano movement, which arose at the same time as the conservative movement in Ronald Reagan's governorship in California from 1967 to 1975. The Chicano movement called for a Chicano community, Mexican-American community, to be able to control its own resources and determine its own future. It called for community control of its schools, its economy, its politics, and its culture. It was the largest, most widespread civil rights and empowerment movement by Mexican descent people in the U.S., with the key years being 1965 and 1975, with 1965 being the beginning of the famous Great Strike in California's Central Valley, the San Joaquin Valley, led by Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and the farm workers. And their goal was to establish a union for grape-growing workers and to get wage and benefit increases and basic dignity for their labor and for themselves. And so in the 1960s and 70s, as the governor of the state of California, Reagan fought the efforts of migrant farm workers to win union contracts, vetoing the Agricultural Labor Relations Act, a bill that would grant farm workers collective bargaining rights, In one well-publicized episode, he appeared on television eating grapes in defiance of a union-sponsored boycott against the miserable working conditions in California's vineyards. Another important thing to know about the movement was the intellectual foundation. Self-identified Chicanos, or La Raza, which is also the name of their circular, which means literally the people or community of the race, framed their cultural inheritance as being from the land. And as we might know, with the U.S. invading, declaring war, and later occupying Mexican cession lands, Chicanos' view was that the U.S. border had moved to occupy them. And this impacted students and parents of the community in the Los Angeles school system. And at the time, dropout rates in East LA were nearing 60%, and the system was functionally inadequate. And a way that the Chicano movement sought to improve education in East LA was to create culturally inclusive schools. They demanded bilingual education, more inclusion of cultural traditions, changing of textbooks, the history curriculum they could see themselves in, and even teachers to live in the local neighborhoods. They used pressure in the form of school strikes they called blowouts, which you can see in the background here, and were successful in bringing about such reforms. Later in the 80s, as more educational reform movements took shape across the country to incorporate marginalized voices to the history classroom, the backlash came from the top in the form of then President Reagan's Secretary of Education, Bill Bennett. One flashpoint occurred when Stanford, under pressure from student protests and walkouts, removed a Western Civ requirement for undergraduates that allowed an academic requirement to be satisfied by other non-Western histories or multicultural alternatives like women's studies, Afro-American studies, etc. Bennett put up a large fight over the move and blasted this move from Eurocentric curriculum to a more multicultural one, saying at Stanford in a symposium that the requirements were closing the Stanford mind. And so, let's keep going here. So through the lens of the Chicano movement and Stanford University's responsiveness to student demands for more inclusive history and the conservative backlash, this divide of sort of like adopting the Western canon and sticking to the Western canon versus multiculturalism has continued to gain heat in the ensuing decades. So that brings us to actual critical race theory, also in the context of the civil rights movement. We finally get to talk about, not what people allege what critical race theory is, but the people who are actually theorizing and writing about it in the 70s and 80s. It was originally, as many of us probably know, created and intended for legal scholarship and training lawyers how to scrutinize the law in the spirit of reforming the U.S. legal system to take a hard look at institutionalized racism, the ways in which race has played into producing disparate outcomes in the past and present. It tends to be a lens through which to analyze the ways in which systemic racism and disparate outcomes pervade our laws and institutions. So in the 70s and 80s, guys like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw and Richard Delgado and Patricia Williams and Mari Matsuda started to work on this. This is after the civil rights legislation had been passed, and they asked themselves the basic question that, if all this legislation had passed, why had it not created a more fair and equal society in the United States? And the basic idea that historians and sociologists already know and have adopted today in mainstream is that racism isn't just an individual prejudice, it can be structural and systemic, and that is that structures, institutions, and systems can produce racially unfair outcomes even when they're run and staffed by otherwise well-intentioned people. Kimberly Crenshaw, in an interview that I read, said basically, let's pay attention to what has happened in this country and how what has happened in this country is continuing to create differential outcomes so we can become that country that we say that we are, pretty simply put. So that's what critical race theory was in the legal world. And so the fight over this whole narrative continued on in the classrooms. And so the fight again kind of is between sort of like conventional history and a more bottom-up and history of marginalized voices. And so enter the historian whose quote I read before, Howard Zinn, in his most famous work, The People's History of the United States, which I think has sold over 2 million copies. And so Zinn became the pariah of the established history crowd. Was accused of destroying American history and history education. He writes very clearly in, I believe it's the prologue, that his book should not be used as a standalone, that it should be an accompaniment to more mainstream histories. And it became popular enough that it was featured on this Simpsons episode. Marge Simpson is portrayed at college holding Howard Zinn's People's History. You made it if you've done the Simpsons. Yeah. Okay. So in his work, he focused on issues of race, class, war, history, and essentially it's a bottom-up history, right? Where the voice of traditionally underrepresented groups, the losers, dissenters, the oppressed, the marginalized voices take center stage versus the victors, states, and the elite. And so he makes a very important point in the book that that we should be critical of the stories that we're told and the stories that we're not told, and that the application of history should be to our world today, which is where social studies teaching is going. And he's very critical in his text of blind patriotism, nationalism, rugged capitalism, misogyny, bigotry, racism, jingoism, and patriarchy, all those things. But even his critics, Sam Weinberg, who had written much to disparage Zinn's line, writes, I think this is after Zinn passed away in 2005, reading of people's history encourages students to talk back to the history they are given, regardless of the ideological perspective of the author, to think about what information is not included in the historical story, to ask which chapters of history books are wholly left out, to investigate perspectives that are ignored or silenced. And as I said, because of the bottom-up history, it's spurned by the traditional, conformist, conventional crowd, and it's banned in a lot of places throughout the country. It notably banned in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. So it was mentioned, his work is mentioned in President Trump's 1776 Commission's 1776 report, along with the 1619 Project, which was an effort by Nicole Hannah-Jones to commemorate and emphasize the role that slavery and racism have played in American history on the 400-year anniversary of the first slave ship reaching North America. And Nicole Hannah-Jones, like Zinn, says that enslavement is not marginal in the history of the United States, it's inextricable. And so these two are mentioned by name as what not to do in the 1776 report. And the counterbalance to that in the 90s to Zinn was Lynn Cheney, who was I think she was the chair for the National Endowment for the Arts, or the Humanities. And she argued that history should be more celebratory and affirmational and not be overly critical, and should emphasize the social benefits of accumulations and concentrations of wealth, and should emphasize the American War of Independence as part of the long human struggle for liberty, equality, and justice and dignity, versus the ways it may not have served the interests of all Americans. She's critical of what she called the unleashed forces of political correctness. She was sympathetic to those who see the application of the oppressed voices and having a great hatred for traditional history, and was concerned about the American Historical Association's opposition to privileging the West and Western history, and refers to inclusive history as if traditional history isn't politicized as politicized history. It turns out that a lot of history is politicized. Okay, so this brings us to the last 3 years. And so I'm going to talk about the emergence of the anti-CRT moral panic in our own time. Okay, a lot of this is going to be very, when I put this together based on a couple articles that I read for this, it brought back a lot of things. But it begins, arguably, obviously it begins way before this, but it begins last 3 years with the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and the nationwide civil rights protests that ensued. By the time we get to later that summer, we see institutions like Batavia Public Schools issuing sensitive public statements about social justice and racial justice. And schools took concrete steps to expand diversity and equity and inclusion initiatives and offer professional development on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So by that fall, we already started to see the reactionary backlash by right-wing groups and lawmakers who deemed LGBTQ topics as inappropriate, even pornographic, and called for the banning of lessons on race and racism. And this sort of brings us to September of 2020, where a marginal, obscure right-wing filmmaker was given a megaphone on the Tucker Carlson show on Fox News, referred to diversity trainings as re-education camps, that CRT was weaponized against the American people, called it neo-Marxist cult, that it's indoctrination, that it presented an existential threat to the United States, and a tool to root out conservative ideas and purge conservative employees, and called on the president to issue an executive order about this. And as we know, President Trump watched a lot of Fox News in the White House, probably still does, and on our timeline, he does exactly that the same month. So issues of executive order banning what he termed divisive concepts, things like systemic racism, that individuals are inherently oppressive, or that individuals bear responsibility for historical injustice, or that anybody should be made to feel discomfort or guilt, etc., over their race or sex or ethnicity. And also called on the end of critical race theory in government institutions, federal institutions. And so this led to that the advisory 1776 commission that basically tried to reshape what history teaching should be. I will note most historians would say that it was light on other historians and was widely criticized for what it was doing. And so by the spring of 2021, after that January, you have your first wave of divisive concepts law that went into effect in Oklahoma, in Tennessee, and Texas. And then anything that was a discussion of racism or race-based history, things that was CRT. And so by the summer and fall, anti-CRT, that narrative was a counter-narrative to the previous year's social justice protests and civil rights protests. And so Rufo, in March 2021, tweeted that, still call it tweets, we have successfully frozen the brand critical race theory into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the various cultural insanities under that brand category. So he acknowledges in this tweet that the weaponization of CRT was happening, and this ramped up parent groups and moral hysteria and panic at school board meetings. And so things like this, it's a deleted tweet from the Texas Public Policy Foundation, basically trying to identify, is your child learning critical race theory in the classroom? And they name virtually every worthwhile thing that you might teach in a history classroom as CRT, including things like colonialism or neocolonialism or decolonization with World War II, or talking about diversity or equity or one's identity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that was out there. Real quick, a taste of what people saw and listened to in a 1-minute clip. The Daily Show has always done a really good job of this, so it's going to string a montage together. You guys get a sense of what people saw.
There's growing backlash tonight against what critics call the indoctrination of public school students in an anti-white curriculum. It has to do with the teaching of what is called critical race theory.
Critical race theory teaches people and our children to judge one another not based on the content of their character, but solely on the color of their skin. It would have our children growing up hating this country and hating one another.
It teaches more or less that America is inherently racist, stating more or less that if you're born white, you are necessarily racist.
Essentially, every white person should apologize for being white and what happened 200 plus years ago.
We are tired of the continual drumbeat of our educational system as used to program our kids, to program our kids into thinking that America is a country of hate and division.
Just because I do not want critical race theory taught to my children in school does not mean that I'm a racist, damn it.
Okay. I believe now, I'm going to give Trevor Noah the credit for the joke. He talked about like the power of white lady tears after that. But what you see there essentially was a nightly drumbeat on right-wing TV, and it's in that context that a lot of people start to show up to school board meetings, and it's also the beginning of when educators start to lose their jobs and maybe get investigated and things like that because of this anti-CRT backlash. And so one example is James Whitfield, who's a principal in Texas, who was put on administrative leave and later fired after writing that racism is alive and well in a memo. And Matthew Hahn, who was a social studies teacher in Tennessee, was fired for teaching that white privilege is evidence-based as he read a poem about white privilege to his contemporary issues class. He got fired for reading a poem. When I look at this photograph, man, it hits hard. I see a beleaguered teacher there, probably, I don't know how old he is, but I have to believe he's been teaching a long time. Probably just sitting there in a stupor as to how his institution betrayed him, but or his state betrayed him, whoever betrayed him. But So teachers are getting fired, right, by the fall of 2021. And the courts are battling it out in Arizona, for example, which I think Arizona has a 1-800 like hotline. If your teacher is teaching CRT, you can report them. And I think the protocol is they deport them to camps on the East Coast or something like that. I don't know. That's not true. That's just a joke. It's a bar. It's a Holocaust joke. Too soon. So anyway, but Arizona had a challenge. It struck down the law in a local court, and later was upheld by the Arizona Supreme Court. And other states follow Arizona's lead, and that culminates in Florida's parental rights education bill. The detractors called the Don't Say Gay bill because it limited discussions about gender identities in Florida classrooms and banned education from gender education from elementary schools and limited severely high schools. And other states follow Florida's lead. So that leads, I'm just going to give you a couple snippets here. So one is the situation in Loudoun County, Virginia, which was, by the time you hit 2021, that fall was primed for anti-CRT confrontation. And in Northern Virginia, if we're not familiar with it, I know I wasn't before I did a little poking around, Amazon had opened a fulfillment center there, other tech companies had established locations in Northern Virginia. And so more and more people that were moving to what had been a southern state were more educated, and you had a larger number of immigrant workers. The area went from rural and red to more cosmopolitan and purple. The school district, who's elected by the local people there, tried to reckon with problems with race that it had experienced. It was met with a white conservative backlash there. The trigger was in 2019, the district had done an internal audit and pulled up in their operations disparities between white students and students of color in the areas of discipline, rates of graduation, and the consulting group that did focus groups, minorities regularly reported to them that they experienced regular pervasive racial slurs. And so the school attempted to try to, all prior to the pandemic, try to root out racism. And you know, the administration, to their credit, said it wasn't isolated events, but it's systemic, and they adopted a plan to combat systemic racism throughout the district. They banned students from wearing the Confederate flag. They issued a apology for its own history of running segregated schools. They began to train teachers in things like implicit bias and racial literacy. And then the parent backlash came. Facebook groups formed, rallies, and accusations of reverse racism were wielded, and raucous school board meetings, the one you see in the background here, were had. And by the way, guys, I know I'm going for a long time. If you guys need to go to the washroom, just so you guys can high five you. If you get a drink, please do that. These guys are working hard, so I know I'm taking a long time, so please feel comfortable. Parents, what's that?
You're at 12.
12 what? Oh, an hour? Oh, I'm good, yeah. So I'm gonna go 1 hour.
He could
I'm
go
not
on.
limiting myself to an hour. I can be here in, no, we're not. So anyway, so the parent accusations included things like active grooming, the accusation of grooming, indoctrination, Marxism, teaching children to hate each other because of skin color, anti-white narratives, say stuff here on here. School board members received graphic death threats as well. In spite of this, the school continued on with its program of diversity, equity, and inclusion. This really led to, and I'm sure the government teachers in the room would be able to speak to this more than I will today, but it led ultimately to more mobilization on the far right wing, and it led to a win for the GOP in the governor's race during the midterms in 2022. So I'm going to move on to a little bit of a state of the country here, and I'm going to use the situation in Yorkville. You guys read the story at all? Do we know about this? Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about it.
I shared it 1,000 times and on the shop page.
Awesome.
You should be celebrating the shit out of it.
Yeah, it's a great, well, it's not a great story. What the students did was pretty remarkable. So last year, from what I understand, the school board elections turned out to where 4 seats were occupied based on a nationwide a political action committee that was based in New York, put a bunch of money into the school board race in Yorkville. It's an organization that's taken in, according to Open Secrets, like $3.5 million, and they were able to win 4 seats on the Yorkville board. And so they had tried in May to ban the book by Brian Stevenson called Just Mercy, A Story of Justice and Redemption. And it takes a critical look at the U.S. criminal justice system. And this, as I understand, I talked to a couple of teachers in the district to prep for this a little bit, and they told me that it was an option for a seminar discussion in a sophomore English class. And so it wasn't a required text, kids got to choose it if they wanted to choose it. But ultimately, while they failed in May and August, they banned the use of the book in the classroom as an anchor text. They voted on it 4-2. The students, after this happened, came into the school board meeting and they supported the book, the use of it, their teachers. They criticized the board for giving in and listening to a very small number of parents. So the girl you see the student you see in the photograph there is Alexis Parkman, who was a senior at Yorkville. And at different times she had said, by allowing the opinions of a select few to influence what is taught in our classrooms, you're sending the message that their beliefs are more important than the quality of our education. She went on to say, you're depriving us of our freedom to read and form our own opinions about subjects you deem too controversial, and you're failing our students. So let's clap for that, first of all. That's what What's great about that is the apathy has been shattered, and I would imagine probably will lead to a lifetime of public service in her and the other kids that showed up. So the English teachers at Yorkville were really upset. They felt like the curriculum they designed was in line with the state standards, the book's available in the library, but it's not available for use in classrooms. So I'm going to run through this pretty quick. There's a bunch of stuff that I read, and I don't want to over talk you guys here. So in the local community, I'm just going to alert you a few things. Political action committees had run over 100 candidates for school boards in the Chicago suburbs. And the Chicago suburbs, along with other suburban areas around the country, are prime targets for the book banning and some of the censorship activity because these are swing districts, these are purple districts, and the whole point is not necessarily to have laws be passed, particularly in Illinois. It's about ginning up anger, resentment, and grievance. And so some of the names of these, right, so the 1776 Project at Heart in Yorkville, on its website says that patriotism and pride should be used in American history. They oppose the teaching of critical race theory in the 1619 Project. And so other groups, kind of have like a lot of liberty type names, references to the independence of the United States, stuff like that, kind of like hyper patriotic sort of stuff. And their tactics and their platform ranges from the mundane to the extreme. So they kind of grew out of the anti-mask campaign. They stress things like parents' rights. Parents have a lot of voice in school board activities. They can attend school board meetings, make public comments, they can vote for school board officials, they can serve on committees. There's lots of things that parents already can do, but they're advocating for greater parent rights and transparency and accountability. They typically promote what they call anti-gender ideology and anti-CRT, anti-wokeism, whatever. They support the Parents' Bill of Rights bill in Illinois. And a lot of times they couch what they say in sort of focus on the basics, academics, test scores, things like that, which means that the other stuff, the focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion, things like that, which are actually civic values, violate their personal values. But the idea is to focus on academics, and you don't have to teach the social emotional stuff. You don't have to teach diversity and things like that. And there are ties that exist to heavily wealthy right-wing donors. In the extreme, in two cases that I read about, they insulted and threatened the incumbent board members. That's what happened in Yorkville and Oswego. And they even threatened the diversity, equity, and inclusion trainer in Hinsdale, and the woman who was the consultant quit on the job because of threats to her family. A lot of Christian nationalist talk, a lot of American exceptionalist talk. Wake, Illinois is another one of these groups. They held a symposium, I want to say like last summer, at the Arcana Theater in St. Charles. And one of their operatives, organizers, whatever, is referred to Christopher as a groomer, right? They even aligned with Proud Boys in Downers Grove at a school board meeting there. But anyway, so these are, they're prominent, and they're prominent in a state that is not anytime soon going to pass censorship laws and things like that. But again, the point is not the law itself, it's the pressure. Okay, so, wait. So I'm going to do a really top-level summary. I looked at like 3 different reports, like quantitative data reports for this, and it gets in the weeds quite a bit. But there's some big takeaways that I want to share with you guys tonight. So I'm going to say 3 things here. So first of all, the sources of the 2 main ones. One's PEN America. They've got a great website, lots of resources there to kind of look at the status of things. It's a not-for-profit, nonpartisan, anti-censorship group, and then the RAND Corporation does nonpartisan public policy research. And so there's 3 things that I kind of got out of looking at their work. The RAND Corporation in particular did a study that ended in early 2023 on these topics. So one, the most restrictive educational intimidation laws, that's what the RAND Corporation calls it, at the state and district levels, and book bans are in states with far-right controlled legislatures. That's not a shock, but that's where most of the laws are being passed. The second thing is that these restrictions and book bans tend to focus on discussion material related to 2 topics: race and LGBTQ issues. That's like 60% of it, something like that. And then thirdly, and this is the most important thing, that the book ban and censorship laws, I made references that they're not the point. The point is the broader political and cultural impacts. The goal is outrage and mobilization and anxiety and grievance among parent groups, voters, in politically contested areas, predominantly low poverty, white suburbs. The goal is fear and intimidation among board members, administrators, and teachers. And the goal is to amplify the voices of the minority and to marginalize groups that are aligned with them, parents, board members, and school staff. And so the idea is that political and cultural pressure would be applied in classrooms, libraries, schools, and public education more generally, and in the context of democracy outside of red states. And so just real quick look at book bans. Okay, they're happening where you think they're happening, primarily, and these are some of the titles. And again, the titles tend to be, some classic books, but also books that deal with, politics, dystopias or utopia, sort of dystopian stories, LGBTQ issues, as well as race issues too. So I'm not going to run through this. I'm going to make this available to anybody that wants it. But the big thing is like book bans from 2021-22 going to 22-23 are on the rise. And Florida is the epicenter of it. And there's other states that are also doing large numbers of book bans. You can see where those are at. The language that are used to challenge these books are very hyperbolic, referring to it as porn in schools, sexually explicit, harmful to kids, whatever, and on the same topics that I mentioned before. And they're tied to punishments for educators and librarians. And they've been successful where national groups get involved, is one of the big takeaways. On the educational intimidation piece, the anti-CRT thing, by and large, big trend in the last 3 years. And what it's done is expanded avenues for parents that already have a lot of jurisdiction over school boards to have more. And it's allowing them, parents that want to challenge a piece of curriculum or a method or whatever, to do that and have an impact on all kids in schools, not just their own kids. Because many schools have an opt-out policy for readings and things like that. And the goal is to design and spur schools, educators to engage in self-censorship, to foster a chilled climate of public education. And it's working. Anyway, so the bills themselves, they target LGBTQ representation, expression in public schools and libraries and in the classroom. They put a lot of blanket restrictions in place. And a couple things here, right? Talked about the intent. The conclusion, though, is it's worse in 2022 than it was in 2021 in terms of the punishments and things like that. I'm going to skip that over. So the map of intimidation bills, the education intimidation bills, again, they're occurring where you expect them to occur. They're getting passed where you expect them to get passed. But I also want you to notice this color here, right? That manila color or whatever, that's all but like 4 states in the union, okay, where these bills have been proposed by lawmakers in state legislatures. Okay, and so the name of the report is called Walking on Eggshells. I'm going to run through this very, very quickly. This is the RAND Corporation stuff. And so one of the things we can probably talk about here is that these laws and policies by the data are confusing to teachers. A lot of teachers don't even know they're in place. But for those that do, they're well aware of the topics that they are to stay away from, typically race and gender. And so one of the things that also comes out of it is the pressure to censor is not felt equally, right? It's felt primarily by high school teachers, teachers of color, teachers of the humanities, people that might wade into these topics, and they're doing a lot of self-censoring. And so, the topics at the bottom here, like, it ranges. It's not just the two topics I mentioned, it's things like voting and voting rights and elections and climate change and gun safety regulations, become sort of hot button topics or off limits topics, when these are the things we should be talking about in the social studies classrooms. So kids can hear people that disagree with them and they can engage in these conversations. They can be moderated by someone who has a vested interest in their education and not actually in indoctrination. So anyway, a couple interesting, actual qualitative, so there was 8,000 teachers that were analyzed for this effort, and they also got 1,000 written responses from teachers. I'm going to share a few of those with you, right? On the topic of, CRT and stuff like that, there's one that reads, we were told not to teach critical race theory. No one was. The past 2 years have made me nervous about teaching Frederick Douglass because I don't think the people in my community know the difference between teaching Black history and teaching critical race theory. So, other stuff, right? So the other two censoring pressures, not laws, right? The laws have a byproduct effect, but district administrators, right? District administrators who are fearful of parents and backlash and things like that, as teachers are as well. They push teachers to maybe avoid controversial topics or avoid the conversations about preferred pronouns, okay? Or try to limit teacher autonomy in selecting sources and making sure they, approve things in teams and getting administrative or board approval, things like that, right? A lot of the messages are vague because they don't want to be held to some specific standard, right? And so teachers, in many cases in the survey, expressed doubt whether their administrators would support them if they ever came down to a parental challenge. So evidence here where it reads, while it was never explicitly stated by my district not to discuss gender or race-related topics in the classroom, I know my district would not have had my back should I choose to add instruction on these important issues. They would be quick to defend their practices and blame me that I veered away from the curriculum and what was supposed to be taught. I think a lot of teachers would probably understand that idea. Okay, and then the last, most major source of pressure comes from parents themselves, right? And this is a phrase that I love that was coined by our very own John Dryden, the principle, my mom can kick your principal's ass, which essentially is this fear that school leaders and teachers, for that matter, have of parents, especially if they're litigious and they're coming from some money and in white, low poverty suburban communities. And so teachers report that the potential for parent complaints and backlash drives them just to avoid topics, right? As one teacher said in the survey, I feel like I have a sword over my head, and any parent is able to cut the string if they disagree with the curriculum for legitimate reasons or not. Another teacher, a special ed teacher, said, I'm extremely cautious, not because my school district, but because of the parents and their social media reactions. They can ruin a teacher's reputation in a single post. One of the most significant piece of data that I pulled out of this, and actually, I should say, I didn't pull it out. Joseph Kahn, who was an educational expert out in California, we went to a democracy school conference 2 weeks ago, and he said that teachers avoid controversial topics in this RAND study, according to the RAND study, teachers avoid controversial topics because 25% said district and state directed to restrict their sensitive materials, but 65% that knew about the laws restrict their personal assessment based on their own assessment, based on fear and desire to avoid scrutiny, desire to avoid misperceptions by members of the community, and they don't, or maybe they know they won't have support. For those, in other words, are self-censoring. Okay, so the results of this, right? So what it does to teaching conditions and student learning conditions. So bottom line, and now, like I said, I'll make this available to anyone who wants it. Teaching, planning, communicating are made more difficult. You have to check and recheck and verify. Can I use this source? Can I not? Right? Teachers report reduced autonomy in the survey. Stress, right? The name of the report is walking on eggshells. It feels like teachers are constantly walking on eggshells. It's harder to meet the needs of one of the major outcomes is that with these acts of censorship, with book bans, it's harder to meet the needs of vulnerable students, students that need representation in curriculum, students that need to read books that affirm who they are, right? And so by taking those things out, what schools are doing is inflicting trauma on these vulnerable student populations. And with the censorship of non-traditional history or whatever, students feel less seen. And on top of that, teaching becomes less effective when these things happen, right? Because these sources are things that develop students' critical thinking skills. They expand students' views and understanding the world, help them become more worldly, they help them become more empathetic. A lot of these sources are more engaging, right? And so it also gives students the tools to operate in a diverse democracy. And so these bans and these restrictions sort of curtail that. And so again, just some qualitative stuff here. The situation created by the state makes teaching even more difficult and less attractive as a profession. Said one elementary school teacher. We work in an atmosphere of fear and paranoia to even teach the content contained in the state standards. Okay, in high school, ELA teacher said, I feel more vulnerable approaching these topics now than I ever have in my entire career in teaching high school. I don't know how much longer I can continue to teach under these conditions. Okay, other teachers reported that we're supposed to be able to be shoulders for students to lean on. Now I feel like some of my lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, and more students are knowingly suffering, and there's nothing I can do about it without risking my job. Okay, black male teacher who is an English teacher in high school said, as a black male, it's difficult to help younger black males see their place in society in the larger context without resources that discuss race and gender. Okay, part of the survey, interestingly, I think like 20 different responses, talk about how these laws embolden some teachers. Not very many, but some, right? One said that limitations in other states have strengthened my resolve to teach race and gender-related topics to my students. My licensed and professionals empower me to make educationally sound decisions and grow compassionate human beings. Another teacher said, I refuse to comply. You must teach the past. We can improve the future. Another one said, my students are more important than any other board policy. If I get in trouble, then it would be worth it. One teacher actually said, I sort the shit out in public at a bar. That's not the Rand Corporation. Anyway, so I'm gonna skip past this. I'm gonna get to what I want to close with, which is a 4-minute excerpt. I'm gonna skip to it here real quick of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, who spoke at the 63rd Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, commemorating the 60-year anniversary of the Ku Klux Klan bombing of that church that killed 4 little black girls. And she says,
and that brings me to the warning part of my message. The part where I urge us all to reject complacency and ignorance and work to shore up democratic values and the rule of law. As a first order of business, what is needed is for all of us to pay careful attention to what we know. Oppressors of every stripe, from the slave master to the dictator, have recognized for centuries that knowledge is a powerful tool. They have seen that once acquired, it can be wielded, and once wielded, it is transformative. Knowledge emboldens people and it frees them. The work of our time is maintaining that hard-won freedom. And to do that, we're going to need the truth, the whole truth about our past. We must teach it to our children and preserve it for theirs. In other words, my parents were right all along. As I explained at the outset, during my time as a youngster, my parents taught me lots of uplifting things about places like Birmingham and Montgomery and Selma, the marches and the meetings, the sense of empowerment from belonging to a community in action. Like many of you, I cut my teeth on movement songs, lift every voice and sing. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. But my parents also taught me about the darker moments of the time. The dogs, the fire hoses, the bombs. There was a reason my parents felt it was important to introduce me to those uncomfortable topics. And it was not to make me feel like a victim or crush my spirits. To the contrary, my parents understood that I had to know those hard truths in order to expand my horizons. They understood that we can only know where we are and where we're going if we realize where we've been. Knowledge of the past is what enables us to mark our forward progress. If we're going to continue to move forward as a nation, we cannot allow concerns about discomfort to displace knowledge, truth, or history. It is certainly the case that parts of this country's story can be hard to think about. I know that atrocities like the one we are memorializing today are difficult to remember and relive. But I also know that it is dangerous to forget them. We cannot forget, because the uncomfortable lessons are often the ones that teach us the most about ourselves. We cannot forget because we cannot learn from past mistakes we do not know exist.
So before I conclude, thank you for being here tonight, and please, if you haven't already, make sure you grab another drink, and the suggested entry fee is $5, so the tip jar over there. Justice Jackson actually did pay $50 to use that clip tonight, so that's what we're making. But I'd like to open it up to questions that you might have, and maybe, I know there's a lot of educators there, I'd love to hear your perspective on these topics. So thank you.